Welcome to the Politics and Public Finance Podcast, in-depth conversations that bring unique insights into the nexus between how governments manage our finances and the work of elective representative bodies such as parliaments. You're listening to Politics and Public Finance Podcast with Jeff Dubrow.
Welcome to Politics and Public Finance. My guest today, Paikiasothy, Saravanamuttu from the Center for Policy Alternatives in Sri Lanka. We'll be talking about the debt crisis, democratic reforms, and human rights, and the linkages between them. And it's interesting because I first heard an interview with Paikiasothy on CBC's The Current on May 20th of 2022, and it brought up so many questions that I really wanted to reach out to this gentleman and have a chance to talk to him. And so fortunately, he was good enough to come on the podcast. Also, I was at a conference in Washington, D.C. a couple of weeks ago, and I participated in a panel on debt transparency. And my job was to get all the non-experts on public debt fired up, which was not an easy task. So I talked about the 5 reasons why non-practitioners should care about debt transparency. I'll share that top 5 list after my interview with Paikiasothy Saravanamuttu from the Center for Policy Alternatives. Paikiasothy Saravanamuttu, welcome to Politics and Public Finance.
Thank you.
It's great to have you here. I really would like to delve deeper into some of the issues that you discussed on that CBC interview with Matt Galloway, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, on May 30th. I was driving my car and I listening to The Current, as I often do, and there you were, and I thought the interview was excellent. But sometimes specialists like myself have questions that we want to drill down to a little further, and of course, that wasn't something that was permissible in the time that you had allocated for the interview. So I'd like to ask you a few questions, if I may. And I guess maybe I should start by saying, what has changed since your interview in May 20th, 2022 in Sri Lanka with regard to the governance situation and the debt crisis?
Well, first of all, of course, the then Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa, the former president, resigned. Then subsequently, his brother, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, resigned. The Aragalaya, or the struggle, the demonstrations that happened intensified and led to these resignations. Then Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe, who was the only member of the United National Party in Parliament, accepted that position without conditions on the grounds that he was going to save the economy from total collapse. Then, of course, when Gotabaya Rajapaksa resigned in July, Ranil Wickremesinghe, as per the Constitution, was elected the president of the country. And that is because Parliament has to choose the successor to complete the unexpired term of the president who has resigned. Now, that, of course, leads to questions of legality as opposed to legitimacy. And the argument, therefore, is that, yes, okay, Ranil Wickremesinghe became president perfectly legal, following the constitutional provisions. But the question was of legitimacy because he was the only member of his party elected at the last general elections to Parliament, and that too was on a national list. It wasn't a direct election. Well, one of the first things that Wickremesinghe did as president was to clamp down fairly brutally on the Aragalaya by evicting them from Gaulface and the areas that they had congregated in. And subsequently, he has come down very hard on dissent on the Aragalaya. He has even used the draconian, Prevention of Terrorism Act, which Sri Lanka had pledged before the United Nations Human Rights Council.
Sir, I'm just going to ask you, what is the Aragalaya?
The Aragalaya is the struggle. The Aragalaya is the outpouring of all of these people, calling for the Rajapaksas to go home and calling for them to return the money that they allege that they have stolen. So his human rights record since he has become President Wickremesinghe, that is, has been particularly appalling, to be quite frank. Over 3,000 people have been arrested and detained for congregating, and some on the flimsiest of excuses. On the economic front, we have managed to get a staff agreement with the IMF, but that requires ratification, which waits upon an international conference with our creditors. We are hoping that Japan will convene that conference and that the Chinese will agree to a haircut, because the argument is that all creditors should be treated equally. So if that is successful, we may at the very earliest look forward to a staff agreement in the early part of next year. In addition to...
And maybe I should just jump in and just, first of all, clarify for those who are not focused on debt management on a regular basis that a haircut is a reduction in the interest rate that's being charged on loans. Maybe we could just come back to the issue of the election of the president, because you mentioned, and then we can talk about the economic reforms with the IMF. Because you mentioned in your interview, and as you know, I went back through the interview and I listened to some quotes, but you mentioned specifically that regime change needed to take place. And I, of course, don't advocate for that, but I'm just going back to what I heard from the interview. You said you said that regime change is the precursor for systemic change in Sri Lanka. How did the election of the president play into that situation? I think you've already alluded to that, but maybe you could talk about that a bit more.
Yeah, I think the election of Ranil Wickremesinghe as president, people were somewhat hopeful that that would lead to the implementation of a slew of reforms, both political and economic. And as I said, on the political front, it has been very disappointing. On the economic front, of course, he has talked about bringing in, and we will get a budget in November, that, we have to... Gotabaya Rajapaksa slashed the tax base. He reduced it. We are one of the lowest tax brackets in terms of collection of revenue. So taxes are going to have to be increased. We also have to think in terms of a reduction of the public service. We have 1.5 million public servants for a population of 22 million. That has got to be dealt with. Then we have state-owned enterprises that are making losses by the millions daily, and that has to be also looked at. We have a line item in the budget 13 years after the war has ended, which has the military budget eclipsing the totals for education and health. That has to be looked at as well. So there are a number of specific initiatives that have to be taken on the economy, which one is hopeful that Mr. Wickremesinghe, President Wickremesinghe, will be able to implement. But overall, I think the problem here is that the Rajapaksas brought to a sort of crescendo, as it were, the basic bad governance, particularly on the economic front, where people have been led to expect a culture of entitlement, where all public services are subsidized, where you have free education, you have free health, you get a job in the public service, you're looked after from cradle to grave kind of argument. So that has to change. And in order for all of this to happen, I think you need to have a government that is trusted by the people, who have their confidence, who will speak to them, communicate with them cogently and coherently as to why they have to make these changes. And that is, again, an area on which the Wickremesinghe government is not particularly strong.
And I think, my understanding was that he was very close to the previous president, and that was one of the reasons there was such an objection to him being appointed president or elected by the National Assembly as president.
Well, there is a public perception that he is somewhat of a proxy, but that is also because his parliamentary circumstances are such that he has to rely on the support of Gotabaya Rajapaksa's 2/3 majority in parliament. So in a sense, he is somewhat of a prisoner of that.
I see. So now going to the situation with the IMF, a lot of the reforms that you mentioned and mentioned that need to take place. I've had a lot of conversations with people about the fact that sadly these reforms, like it's all of us can line up and sort of, and I'm not suggesting you did this, but all of us can sort of line up and bash the IMF for a whole series of reasons. But the problem is that they tend to take these types of reforms don't seem to happen in countries until a debt crisis happens and the IMF then comes in. So, you know, the public wage bill, out of control, state-owned enterprises, these are pretty much what you see across the board in any situation where there's a debt crisis. Why did Sri Lanka get to that place? Why was there no oversight in place to stop that from happening?
Well, I think to begin with, all our governments since we got independence in 1948 have treated the population as voters rather than citizens. So every election you have promises made whereby 10,000 new jobs in the public service are offered, 10,000 rupees more are to be given to those who are in the public service, and it's gone on like that. It's sort of an auction of unearned resources, as it were, as Lee Kuan Yew, I think, did mention with regard to the Sri Lankan economy. In addition to that, I think the parliamentary system that we had was probably better in maintaining overall control and providing some kind of checks and balances on profligacy by the executive. But that changed in 1977. We got an executive presidency, and all power seemed to be concentrated in the hands of the president, and parliament effectively became a rubber stamp. So one of the proposals in terms of the political reform agenda is to strengthen the parliamentary committees, the Parliamentary Committee on Finance, the Parliamentary Committee on Public Enterprises, the Parliamentary Committee with regard to, state-owned enterprises. So there is therefore a recognition that Parliament, as being the organ of government that should have control and oversight over finances, that is restored, and in fact that is strengthened. Because what you have had in the last 2 decades or so is a presidency which is all powerful, which has been able to act with a fair degree of impunity in terms of the spending and all of that, and has got away with effectively, to use the metaphor, blue murder, as it were.
Sir, you are into my favorite topic. This is my passion. This is what I studied in university. So please help me to understand when you talk about an executive presidency versus, within the context of a parliamentary system, what changed in 1977 to make that happen?
Well, what changed was effectively that the executive was directly elected by the people in a separate election. And you become the chief executive or the president of the country when you have won 50 plus 1% of the vote, of the popular vote. Parliament, on the other hand, is elected separately, entirely separately, on a system of proportional representation. The president chooses the prime minister and the cabinet from Parliament. The president also has another power, which is particularly, I think, potentially distorting as far as democratic governance is concerned. He appoints the secretaries to all the ministries. So thereby he has control of the bureaucracy as well.
Yeah, you would expect the prime minister to make those kind of appointments or to be an executive. Right. Very interesting point. Sorry, go ahead.
As one prime minister under this presidential system said, look, I have all the powers of a personal assistant and nothing more. It was, although you're sort of a heartbeat away from the presidency,
right,
if something through the president.
Right. Kind of like the vice president of the United States. I'm just kidding.
Somewhat like that. But, this is a very, very lopsided structure of power that we have had. And the argument with regard to bringing in an executive presidency was the argument that under a parliamentary system, when there were big majorities, the governments that were formed were able to completely reverse their predecessors' economic policies and whatever. So the argument was that we needed a strong presidency for economic development. Also, that we needed a strong presidency to unite the country. And of course, what has happened since, we've had two insurgencies in the South and the 30-year-old civil war, which has proved that argument to be somewhat fallacious.
This is absolutely fascinating, and I can very much understand that oversight of a president, parliamentary oversight of a president, the system is simply not set up for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So not only would you need to strengthen, or would Sri Lanka need to strengthen its parliamentary committees, but is it also going through the process of sort of trying to figure out how to rejig is not the right word, obviously, but redistribute powers between the president and the prime minister?
Well, one of the things that has come out in the Aragalaya, the struggle that has happened recently, and of course was very much in the public debate even before that, since the presidency was set up in this manner, is that it should be abolished because it is so powerful that it should be abolished. There have been various attempts to bring in checks and balances through constitutional amendments, but they have really, in effect, skirted around the edges rather than gone to the heart of the matter, which is that the president can act with impunity.
That's absolutely fascinating, and a very challenging situation indeed. And just so I understand, this time around, the president was selected by the parliament, but that's not usually the case. That was because of the extraordinary situation, and there wasn't time for an election.
Yeah, it's happened once before when a president was assassinated, but here he left office.
So what's your prognosis? Is there enough political will to make those systemic changes that you mentioned in terms of, I won't say abolishing the presidency, but certainly creating that parliamentary accountability that's required to exert better control over the financial situation?
Well, at the present moment, the problem here is that the parliament is a parliament that was voted in August 2020, and is a parliament that gave Gotabaya Rajapaksa a two-thirds majority. Now, Ranil Wickremesinghe has to work with this parliament unless he goes for a general election. And I think the point here is very simply that no political reform is probably going to happen until you have a general election and parliament is given a fresh mandate.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is key. The existing members of parliament are not really interested in any of the political reforms as such.
That's fascinating. And you did mention, in your interview with Matt Galloway that, quote, the population is absolutely fed up with the corruption, the graft, the incapacity to govern. Indeed, this extends to the political class, the 225 members of parliament. What did you mean by that?
Well, I mean, the entire political class, and that is sort of represented by the 225 members of parliament, are seen to be complicit in economic mismanagement, misgovernance, the loot, the corruption of the treasury that has taken place, the terrible human rights record, the allegations of war crimes and all of that have been gone unpunished. Basically, at the heart of governance in the country has been this notion of impunity. No one has been held to account for any of the great crimes and misdemeanors that have taken place. And therefore, they are fed up with this old class of people, and they want to have fresh blood, fresh thinking into the political system.
I'm going to overcharacterize things here by saying that the West, because obviously I don't speak for the West, even though I live in the West, but I think my understanding is the view has very much been that, Sri Lanka as a middle income country, lower middle income probably, but nonetheless a lower middle income country where life was relatively good, was really, the situation was shattered by the debt crisis. What concerns me about what you're saying is harshness with which the government has responded to the protests, and whether we're talking potentially about a situation where we have potential democratic backsliding.
No, yes. I mean, the argument of the current regime with regard to why they have come down so hard on the Aragalaya and on the dissenters, etc., is that what led to Gotabaya Rajapaksa fleeing the country, basically, when he left the presidency, was that they took over the presidential secretariat, the president's residence. They took over temple trees, that they had sort of invaded public property, and that this was part of a conspiracy to overthrow the state. And Ranil Wickremesinghe's government has sort of said, look, we are not going to tolerate any of that, and we are going to use the full force of the law. Now, I think partly he does it because, A, he has to show the Sri Lanka People's Party majority that elected him president that he is a strong president and he will protect and secure them. Secondly, I think he wants to make sure that when the IMF deal kicks in and when there are further sacrifices that will be demanded of the people, that there will be no disturbances in the streets. So it's partly also deterrent. And I think the third point is that since he does not have any allies or any members of parliament from his own party, he can't trust anyone in the political architecture.
So why was he selected then? Sorry to interrupt. So why was he selected by Parliament?
Well, because I think Parliament expected him that if they selected him, that he would do as the SLPP majority demanded or expected, that he would be very much their creature.
I see. Turning back to the issue of the not loan forgiveness, but the conference with the creditors that you were mentioning. So you mentioned China and you mentioned Japan. What is the extent of private sector debt in Sri Lanka? Because it's funny, I learned really from a conversation with Tim Jones from Debt Justice on previous podcast. Certainly, there are some serious issues with indebtedness to China, but private sector debt also seems to be a very large problem in many countries that are going into debt distress. Could you talk about that for a moment?
Yes. I mean, in terms of the international debt, the vast majority of it is private sector debt in the sense of it's the international sovereign bond holders who are in the market. As far as the official debt is concerned, the Chinese hold something like just over 10% of the debt. So they're not the largest. Japan comes close behind, and then comes India and all the other countries. But the problem with the Chinese, of course, is that they are the ones who are least favorable to us going to the IMF, and they would rather give us more loans to sort out our problems. And the way in which the Chinese lent to us, I think, nurtured a climate of non-transparency and corruption.
And maybe we could end on that topic, which is the vanity projects. And again, going back to the interview you had on The Current, you mentioned a number of vanity projects with, quote, no benefit to the people of Sri Lanka. Can you elaborate on the extent of this problem?
Basically, the Rajapaksa regime, and this is not Gotabaya Rajapaksa, but his brother who brought the Chinese in big time, was that they relied on the Chinese to do two things. One was to provide them diplomatic protection against the allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity and all of that. Secondly, was to give them money for infrastructural development and also for these vanity projects. In that, they built the Mattala airport, which is rarely used. They built the port in Hambantota. Now, all of these things were done in the part of the country from which the Rajapaksas came. And so there is no rate of return that the country benefits from. As a consequence, they kept having to borrow more and more, So why I call them vanity projects, where maybe at some point in the not too distant future, hopefully, these things will come on stream and produce some benefit in revenue terms to the Sri Lankan economy. But at the present moment, there is no proper rate of return.
And unfortunately, the Hambantota Port, and I hope I pronounced it properly, is one of those poster childs for
absolutely
in many ways. So I would be amiss to take not to ask you at least one or two questions. Why was it not economically viable?
Well, I mean, I think it was not economically viable because the Colombo port was doing much of what Hambantota was expected to do. Hambantota would have come on stream if our economy expanded considerably, and it didn't at that time. So in that respect, it came too early. If there was ever going to be a crying need for it, it probably came too early. And there were also the whole question of, that the Indians were first asked to fund it, and the Indians said that it would not be viable. There was supposed to be a huge rock in the middle of the port, which the Chinese built the port and then got another contract to remove the rock. And, so there were all sorts of allegations of that nature as well. So it hasn't proved to be successful in economic terms as it was expected to be. But you can come up with economic projections into the future which say that, yes, you have a port in Hambantota, it can take the load off Colombo, and it could, contribute towards the economy in a positive way.
And now you have a situation where the port was repossessed, for lack of a better term, by the Chinese, and is now owned by China for the next, I guess, well, at the time it was repossessed for 99 years.
99 years, yes.
What has been the reaction to that in Sri Lanka?
Well, I think the reaction to that in Sri Lanka has been somewhat of, muted displeasure, if you like, because the Chinese assistance to us has not drawn the same kind of opposition that, say, Indian or Western assistance to Sri Lanka has drawn. So there is a sense in which the population is somewhat wary of China and coming out against China. And in that time when the human rights question of war crimes and all of that was at the top of the agenda, that the Chinese were providing us with support to fend off these allegations led to people sort of saying that, China is our best friend internationally.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'm very bad with promising to ask a last question and then to keep the discussion going. But what I will promise you is that we're at 26 minutes, and we'll make a hard stop at 30. So if you just give me a couple more minutes, I appreciate that. But I am notorious for doing that, unfortunately. I wanted to give you an opportunity just to talk about your organization, the Center for Policy Alternatives, if I have the name right.
Yes.
And what it does, and perhaps how you fit into all of these issues that you've just raised.
Well, we are basically a non-governmental organization which does research and advocacy on questions of governance and conflict transformation. And we do it largely from a human rights perspective. And most recently, we've had a number of instances where we do public interest litigation. So we've gone to court on a number of issues, on fundamental rights cases. We also provide written and oral submissions whenever there are parliamentary or presidential commissions on questions of governance. We also do opinion polling. We have a blog site called Ground Views, and the Sinhala and Tamil versions, Vikalpa and Matram. We also have a unit that monitors the incidence of violence, and violence broadly speaking, not just in terms of physical violence alone, but also in terms of, the systemic violence that happens during election times. So we do a broad range of activities. We are not looked upon too kindly by governments. They think of us as being sort of agents of foreign powers, and the usual accusations are slung against us. But we forge ahead to the extent possible under these trying circumstances sometimes.
And I was very taken by how you addressed in that interview, now famous or infamous interview that I've referred to, how you address issues horizontally. You talk about democracy, you talk about the economy, and you talk about human rights. And that's not, yes, those issues are interconnected, but you don't often hear people talking about
Don't necessarily have that, yes. Yeah, that is true, because I think, we have always maintained that what we've had now is not just an economic crisis or a political crisis, but it is a crisis of governance. And, we need to come to terms with this whole question of impunity. And we're glad that most recently that the Supreme Court has taken a very liberal attitude and given leave to proceed on cases of holding people responsible for the current crisis.
Last question. This time it will really be the last question. You mentioned that the then president, Rajapaksa, had no capacity to understand the economy. I would have thought that would have been the role of the Ministry of Finance and the central bank to guide them. Is it just a matter of he wasn't listening to them, to those institutions, or are those institutions not playing the role that they're supposed to play?
I think it was very much a question of, look, because he was the executive president, the governor of the central bank, the minister of finance, all of these were his appointees. Secondly, the question was, because he didn't know too much about that particular subject matter, he allowed them to carry on. And when they did come up, well, not necessarily the minister of finance or the governor of the central bank, but when we were told that we needed to go to the IMF at least 2 years before this crisis happened, they were obstinate and stubborn in their refusal to do so. So, it was, I think, Gotabaya Rajapaksa was really not a politician. He was someone who was a military man, and he was his brother's Secretary of Defense. So he didn't really fully understand what governance and what negotiation, talking, compromise, sensitivity, empathy towards people were. And as a consequence, he paid for it by having to flee the country.
Paikiasothy, Saravanamuttu, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. We don't have the same listenership that the current has, but it's been an honor to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
It is so interesting how our guest today brought the issue of the debt crisis and democratic reform and human rights, and I would say backsliding, democratic backsliding, all together into one package. You don't get people who think horizontally like that a lot. I found that fascinating. That is our podcast for today. Politics and Public Finance is produced and sponsored by Huge Impact Marketing. Wherever you're listening to this podcast, be sure to subscribe. I'm Jeff DeBro. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.